more minute. Finish herding the cats here.
Yeah, no,
We're going to try to get to lunch on time, too. There's actually 2 tours that are going to be conducted. I don't know if we're going to start. There's going to be one at 12 and another one at 12:30. So we've got box lunches out there. But more of the logistics afterwards. All right, let's get started. So our next distinguished speaker, I'm hoping I get this right, Satya Gupta, did I get that right? He is Versex's visionary founder and chief technology officer with over 25 years of expertise in embedded systems, network security, and systems architecture. He has helped build and guide the company through key growth phases from initial funding, developing core technology with key partners, including Raytheon and Lockheed, to launching an enterprise-class GA product. I turn it over to you, Satya.
Hi, good morning. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it for you spending my time, your time on me. So I like you to look at this gentleman, Mikhail Matveev. He's one of those expert hackers from Russia. His gang is named Babuk. And what he's done is he's given a very brazen interview to this Brian Krebs. The really interesting part of this interview, there's like, over 15, 20 minutes of read, but this particular paragraph caught my attention big time, because what the question here is, how do you access networks? And this gentleman's response was that he's been using vulnerabilities, especially the remote code execution vulnerabilities, RCE vulnerabilities. This is a term I'm going to use again and again. Remote code execution vulnerabilities. And one of the things that he said out here was that he used Fortinet. Fortinet, with this one vulnerability, he was able to access 48,000 organizations. 48,000 organizations. That's how he gets in. And so the important point here is that RCEs, remote code execution vulnerabilities, are really nasty problems. So, if we think about it, we've been conditioned to believe that, a breach is imminent and it's inevitable. The bad guys are already in your network. We've heard stories about, there are only 2 kinds of CISOs, one who knows that they've been hacked and the other one who doesn't, right? So, but the fact is that, what really is the root cause of the problem is that we don't patch very well. And especially in the OT sector, right? We have heard stories, Dr. Shinoy was speaking about it, that you don't get the opportunity to patch. It's just very difficult to patch. And if you don't patch, there's Mikhail waiting for you out there. And there's another reason. There's 28,000 vulnerabilities that kind of surfaced in the National Vulnerability Database. And believe me, it's only like about 5 to 10% of your applications are registered in the National Vulnerability Database. So imagine how much more there would be. But what's interesting is that out of those 28,000, there were 8,000 RCE vulnerabilities. Mikhail's favorite vulnerability. This is how he gets in. So, I think what we have is we're looking at it in a little bit of a backwards way. The vulnerability allows you to get in. And it's not the other way around. People believe that the attacker is already in, but what they forget is, how did they get in? It is the vulnerability that brought the guy in. So if you look at, all software is very predictable. If I give you a calculator and I ask you to add 2 plus 2, the answer is going to be 4 today, tomorrow, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, hopefully. So the machine does something very predictable. So there's some user who's sending data, the machine does some calculation on it or some math on it, and it drops some instructions into the CPU's execution cache. Sorry, this thing right here. The application is supposed to run on its own guardrail, whatever the developer actually said it should be running on. But when there's a vulnerability, the attacker's data kind of derails this whole operation and starts serving this guy's purpose. So in other words, the important point is that the application could be doing its own thing, And the attacker wants to subvert that because they want to be able to run their code on it, right? And so this is very important. This point of inflection here is really how we have to think about how can I keep the application running on its own guardrails. It's a little bit like a GPS kind of thing, right? You sit in your car, you punch in an address, GPS somehow magically gets you to your destination. You kind of follow it blindly, it will get you where you need to go. And so, if you think about it, on road number 1, the only role or only rule that you have to follow is to make sure that you're following the GPS to get onto road number 2. What's happening on road number 3, 5, 8, 10 doesn't really matter at that moment, right? So it's at that moment of time that's really crucial. Are you making the right decision or not? And if we can distinguish between when the application is running, is it running on its own guardrails or is it running on a different guardrail? That is the key question. And if you can identify that this application is not serving instructions from a bad actor, then we can keep the application safe. Even if the vulnerability is there, if I can find that the vulnerability is getting exploited and I can stop it right there because I have this point of inflection right here that I can recognize, then the vulnerability doesn't really matter. If you don't patch, that's good. It's not going to be the end of the world. So if you think about what we've done so far, is we've deployed, firewalls at the network layer, IPSs, WAFs, DLPs, HIPs, EDRs, all kinds of things. We've thrown the kitchen sink at it, and yet the bad guy manages to get in. Right? Why? Because all of this is kind of, doesn't take into account that a vulnerability, especially a zero-day vulnerability, or at least one that you haven't patched, is going to be able to give the attacker an opportunity to derail the operation right here. And then the attacker is back in action. These are really hard problems to solve. If you treat the application like a black box, if you can't see what's going on out here, when the attacker gets control, they can drive you off the cliff. They can do millions of other things out there, There's no knowing what they'll end up doing. So if you're trying to catch it by looking at all kinds of logs and, looking at system calls, treating the application as a black box, right? You're not going to figure out, what's going on out there. This story will continue no matter how hard we try. So if you think about it, there's two strategies that you can follow. One is the app control strategy, which is basically block code that is not really, of proven. It doesn't have a good provenance. If we can do that, then we actually have been able to block any kind of malware. If I want to run Nginx on a server, or I want to run Wonderware, Aviva's Wonderware on a given server, and somebody comes and runs Apache server on it, it just shouldn't run, right? Because it's not authorized to run on it. So I should be able to, be able to determine the code's provenance. I should be able to look at the integrity of that code, and I should make sure it's authorized to run on that particular box. If it is not, then it's goodbye. So this is a very effective strategy of blocking any malware. So, if you look at NIST, a lot of you come from that space. So NIST 800-167, it talks a lot about, how application whitelisting, they call it that, is a whole lot superior. You can block, very effectively, we can block malware from running. So that's one aspect. This is something you do pre-execution. You just don't let malware run. But now let's assume that there's some application that's running. It has some vulnerabilities in it. And there's like 28,000, if you remember, we talked about that, right? So it's not like, good code won't yield to bad code. It does. So you need something at execution stage, which is running in, as your application is running, is keeping an eye on that particular application, making sure that the application is still doing the right thing. If you remember the slide that I had, those train track slides, we want to make sure that the application is doing the right thing at all the time. So now let's look a little bit deeper inside what it means to perform application control. So there are two schools of thought. One school of thought is it's the innocent until proven guilty. A lot of EDR solutions will do that. They'll actually check for the signature of the piece of code that they're about to run. If it doesn't match a known malware, they'll let it run. And they'll, it could be malware that they just don't know about, but they'll let it run. And this is really harmful because, if it turns out to be some malware that they didn't know about and they let it run, if it's fast-acting malware like ransomware or some such thing, is the end of the story. It's like, this is a very gory example, but I'll have to give it to you anyway. It's like, one of those Russian roulette type things, right? You hold it to your gun and hope and pray the chamber is empty kind of thing. So this is the strategy that now, a lot of the EDR solutions follow. They'll check for the signature. If it's good, then let it run. The other approach is the guilty until proven innocent approach, which means if the application or this piece of code doesn't have the right provenance, doesn't have the right integrity, is not authorized to run on that particular endpoint, it just won't run. So, this is like a little shim module that kind of goes in and checks as code is loading up in memory. It says, is this something that is authorized? Does it have the right provenance? Is its integrity intact? And if the answer is no, then that piece of code just doesn't get to run. So this is very effective against malware or any other piece of code that you don't intend to run on your machine. And this is what we call the zero trust execution that my company actually builds. So now let's look at the other activity. What we talked about was the application control, which is basically blocking the malware before it gets started. But now I'm going to talk about execution control. So the application is all good. Its provenance is proven. Now it's loaded up in memory. But it could be code that's vulnerable. So what does EDR do? EDR looks at really I'm sorry, this is a very light graph out there. But if you look at the timeline, this is the timeline out here. The application process gets kicked off by some user's privileges. Then it makes some file system calls. It connects on the network, another connection to the network. This is just an example here, by the way. This is not just a representation and all of what an EDR would do. So it tracks these 4 or 5 different parameters out here over time. So it's built a profile. So this application has a profile now. And if this profile matches that of a known malware, then it's goodbye. This is what is the EDR calls the behavior analysis. So if the behavior of this application starts matching that of a known malware, that's how the EDR would stop it. But the problem is that every day, 450,000 new malware get produced. How do I even capture them, let alone actually plot their behavior out here? So if you look at what they're doing is, so this is the goal here, that we want to be able to stop any process whose behavior starts matching that of a known malware. So that's option number 1. Option number 2 is, here's a little thought process here. So here's some good users and some bad users, and you can probably figure out which one is the bad user here. The bad guy basically sends malformed data. The application, because it's vulnerable, it turns this data into code, like a SQL code or some binary code or some shell code or a web shell, whatever. And then it actually passes this malicious code to some interpreter on your machine, like the OS command interpreter, a web shell, or SQL query, XML bombs, all kinds of things. So this is what we do. We actually look for deep inside the application. We are sitting inside out here. We are watching the application just like the GPS. GPS makes sure that your car is going on on the intended destination. Likewise, we are kind of looking at the code and making sure it's still executing the code that it was supposed to execute. So this is where we kind of nip when we see that bad code is being produced out here, is the protection kicks in, and it's within microseconds. It's not going to drift along like the innocent until proven guilty kind of thing. Until the malware starts doing bad things, we'll start recognizing it's the other way around. As soon as we see that the application is executing outside its own set of instructions and its own guardrails, we'll apply the brakes out there. So if we think about it, what was the difference out here? The EDRs follow what is called an opaque box model. So it kind of looks at a few things like we saw in that chart. It looks at disk activity, network activity, file system activity, any child process that's created, and so on and so forth. And it's like it treats the application as an opaque thing. What's going on inside the application has got no eyeballs on it. As opposed to the clear box strategy, which is basically, I'm going to look at all the code and I'll see if it's operating on its own guardrails or not. And if it is not found to be operating on its guardrails at that very moment, within milliseconds, is the end of the story for that. This is what the ZTE, what we produce here. So if you think about what we just did here is, again, let's come back to this diagram here. As soon as the attacker is able to start, or at least bringing the point here where, where the attacker is beginning to take control, at this particular point is where we'll intercept. And if you think about it, it's a very similar model. And if I were to draw an example, there's a burglar standing, let's say, outside your home. Right? They have a very flimsy lock hanging because that lock is vulnerable. Your application is vulnerable, the lock is flimsy. You kind of breathe on it, it falls apart kind of thing, right? So the attacker gets in. Who knows what the attacker will do once they're in? It's anybody's guess at that particular point. Somebody might run for your paintings, somebody might want to, get your electronics, who knows? And they'll go from room to room to room kind of thing, right? So if we let this thing proceed here, keep letting the bad guy go on and on, it's, you're just playing a game of Russian roulette out here, essentially. But with this approach, I don't really need to know about what the attacker is doing. I don't even need to know if the application is vulnerable or not. As soon as the application deviates from its intended course, it's over. We are all over it. I don't get phased by any, vulnerabilities, this log4j or proxy not shell and all. It's really not a material factor for this particular approach here. So if I turn back to, how does it affect, these very famous attacks, and Dr. Shinoy talked about Stuxnet and how IT got in there. In fact, there was an infected USB stick that somebody left on the floor out there. Somebody else picked it up, stuck it in those in some operations network, and there was malware sitting on it. And that's how, this is the propagation layer for Stuxnet here. So if you look at what Versec does is these green boxes, this attack vector, wherever you see these green boxes is where the zero trust execution engine actually stops these attacks and all. And as he rightly pointed out, there was this, he kind of drew it as a bomb out there. He was talking about the IT layer being the big leaky point where the attacks come in. And he's kind of right. If you look at this, it all started from the IT layers here. Except this one where somebody dropped a USB stick on the floor and somebody else managed to pick it up and all. So in other words, it is possible if you look at code and look at what the code is supposed to do versus what it is doing at that particular moment of time, it's actually very much possible to stop this all in a matter of time. So, so this is our standard Purdue model, and I'm sure all of you are very, very familiar with it. These 5 layers of, of how an OT and IT network is organized. So with the IT layers, as we talked about it, there's all kinds of web-style attacks, which EDR tools, of course, don't protect. And then there are these binary-style attacks here, buffer errors, library injection, all these very standard pieces of attack that we've had. We work with Aviva and then with Schneider Electric, and one of the gentlemen out there, the chief security architect out there, took a solution in a skiff out there, and 30 minutes later they come back with 3 guys who were like 7 feet tall and from some 3-letter agency and all. And so they had what they called the indefensible attack. It turns out it was a library injection attack that they said that they just couldn't figure out with any other tool out there. And so with our solution, they were able to stop it without any signatures or any threat feeds and all. That's the other good point, that we don't really need threat feeds, no signatures, nothing is needed. All we need is the code. We are looking at the code, and we're looking at making sure that the code is executing correctly. So if I were to look at a typical workload, on a server or a workstation, you have various kinds of applications running. They could be interpreted applications like something that's running Java or .NET. A lot of OT code runs on .NET. Aviva, for instance, Wonderware, Cytec, all those stacks are all .NET stack. And so if you look at some of the others, there's, of course, binary code, then there's platform code. There's people will write mods out there for Apache and also for business, banking logic and all, or maybe some SCADA logic and all. And then, so if you look at what we have done here, we've actually protected it against malware. EDR does not protect interpreted code against it. So what they do is they look at an executable file like a PE, a Windows executable or a Linux executable, and they'll actually start parsing, looking inside it for various types of dangerous, what they call dangerous APIs essentially. And if they find enough evidence of those dangerous APIs, they'll actually terminate. But this is not, a piece of Java code is not the same thing as a piece of Windows code. It's very different. So EDRs get very easily blindsided. So, if you have that log4j vulnerability that I'm sure a lot of you must have heard out there, it had some Java classes which ended up dropping some web shell, completely blindsided. The EDRs are blindsided by that, not zero trust. We see when the code starts doing bad things, we are able to see any file that was dropped, whether it is Java or .NET, and if its provenance is not proven, it just won't run. For binary malware, EDR does a pretty good job, but we've actually seen cases where attackers have actually packaged their malware with a packer. And this has escaped many of those EDR solutions. If I drop it into their public sandbox, it just says it's a nice piece of code, let it run. And it is really a piece of malware that has, that cannot be trusted. If I look at vulnerabilities, there are really two problems here, right? We talked about malware is different from a vulnerability, right? Vulnerability and RCE vulnerability allows the bad guy to drop malware. So malware is step number 2 in the process, but vulnerability is step number 1 in the process. And so vulnerabilities is very important to protect against vulnerabilities. If you don't do that, then we'll be playing a chasing game all over, right? If the attacker's piece of malware is, we just have to figure out that, we've got the malware, we've got every piece of malware documented. But like we said, there was like 450,000 pieces of malware that get produced every day. It's a problem that you cannot chase ever. The third thing here is that do we need to patch? And with an EDR, it's an extremely urgent kind of thing because the EDR, until it has a signature or an indicator of compromise and all, is not going to be able to protect you. With zero trust, we don't really, you do want to take some patches because they have some performance improvement or some new capability and all. But if it's just a correction of some security flaw, then, the ZTE basically acts as a compensating control. So this is very important because, especially in the OT sector, we don't end up patching. And there's good reason why we don't do that. It's not like, it's just we are lazy or something like that, but if the business disruption is really a killer. But with, we have the ability to actually not have to patch on an emergency basis. You can plan for it as and when you feel like it's the right time to do it, let's just do it at that point. The mean time to protection, this is also really, really important. With a piece of malware, you typically, if I look at many of these vendors, they'll tell you, we've done a great job, we can recognize malware in 6.75 hours. Guess what? 6.75 hours is a lot of time to go turn every machine in your environment into a brick. So, hours, when you start talking in terms of hours and days and weeks and months, it's really no good. If it's not near 0 seconds, it's useless. You'll have to rebuild your infrastructure, and it takes a very long time to be able to bring an oil refinery or something like back online. So the business disruption, with zero trust, we are looking at near zero. Whereas with EDR, if the attacker is skilled, a lot of them are nation-state users. They will be able to get, their whatever it is that they intended to start out with doing. They'll be able to accomplish it. So it's one thing for me to keep saying that, this is great technology, but we came up with these 218. I won't tell you from which agency, but there's a 3-letter agency involved out here. They actually took 4 servers that they banged on it for about a whole week. And this was Vertex, runtime ZTE protecting that application, those 4 applications. In that 1 week, those guys made 14.5 attempts, and 0 of them were successful. There were some 79 RCEs in those boxes. None of them succeeded. And we ended up with a score of 100% out there. The gentleman who was running, he was a very senior person in the DoD. He said, I've never seen a result like this before because people don't, most companies will never put up a box because, these people can take apart pretty much anything. So, so what are some of our customers saying? We've had some very serious stuff going on with Raytheon, which I can't name and all, but Aviva and Schneider are partners. We have, and of course, this is one Australian, it's like the big four in the US, but this one is in Australia. And this is the world, this is the gentleman who heads the World Economic Forum, and of course, KPMG. Questions? Yes.
So, yeah, just a quick question, right? So, when you think of, as a practitioner, we've all been, conditioned to do, defense in depth, right?
Right.
In multiple different areas. However, you can't always do that because you've got limited time, resource, budget, et cetera. So, where do you really get the best value or the most bang for the buck from your perspective?
Sure. So we've been actually, it's a very good question. Most people will not get rid of their EDRs because they think, EDR is kind of talking about how the attacker is behaving, and Versec ZT is talking about how the application is behaving. So it's kind of a complementary kind of a mix out there. But some people, like as you mentioned, who are budget constrained and all, will tell us, hey, let's go head to head. Let's do the same test with you on that server, and I'll put another replica of that with the EDR. And so there are these red team frameworks. There's a couple that like Attack IQ and Safe Breach and a few others like that, which will actually assault your box. And you put a piece of code which is supposed to mimic that that command control center that the APT gangs use essentially. And so they'll assault with some 900 scenarios, and we always come out with 100% score on those. And the EDRs, depending on which EDR and what test and that the customer wants to be able to choose, they've come out 40, 50, 60 percentile on those scores.
Okay, we've got time for one more question.
Yes, Adam.
So I follow a lot of this. You really are looking at the code, making sure it doesn't do what it's supposed to not do what it's not supposed to do. You do OWASP top 10 up there. So I saw things on there like cross-site scripting and CSRF attacks. How would Versec prevent a CSRF attack? If a CSRF attack is a legitimate request from a legitimate browser, how can it possibly know that the browser was tricked into sending that request?
So what happens is that we actually, when you first connect, we actually send another token that the Versec application generates. So for the next request, if that token doesn't come back to us, we have a little shim that we put into your browser. So if the browser doesn't return the token that we asked for, then we know it's not the same, it's acting under some duress, basically.
Well, it's your token. So this is something additional you're doing
Yes.
that you did not talk about.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
But somebody inject the token, the token which you are expecting, if somebody inject the token, then it can be compromised, right?
So the token is, the checksum and all of those things are maintained. The integrity of it is maintained. It's very easy to tell if the token has been hacked and all.
But it's on the browser. So you put some code on the browser to send the token. If somebody compromised that browser plugin to
Yes.
send the token to you,
Yes.
it can be compromised.
So the token, if it's, it's inserted inline, when you connect with your browser, when you connect to the server sends back this token. It doesn't exist in the browser as is kind of thing.
Okay, great. I love the technical deep dives. Versec will be here, so we can continue those discussions in between the breaks and offline. So thank you very much, Satya. Appreciate it. Also, Versec is our lunch sponsor, so we've got a box lunch out there after this next presentation. I would like to introduce, it is my pleasure, Dr. Calvin Nobles was recently appointed, I want to make sure I get this right, the Department Chair and Associate Professor of Information Technology and Management at Illinois Institute of Technology. He previously worked as Vice President supporting information and cybersecurity at Wells Fargo. Dr. Nobles is a cybersecurity professional and human factors practitioner with 25 years of experience. One more, he retired Naval Cryptologic Warfare Officer. I can't read the rest. I'm in awe. So, pleasure having you.
Thank you.
Oh, technology problems.
with my presentations.
The next presentation.
Yes, I got it. Good morning. Good morning. I swear I'm gonna get us out of here as fast as I can. This shouldn't take too long. I remember I had 25 minutes to brief one of our VIPs at the university. It took him 10 minutes to get into the room, another 2 minutes to do an introduction, so I was left with like some crazy small amount of time. But I'm gonna get us through this morning. So thank you. And so the reason I chose this topic is very simple. As you hear, I came from the Navy cryptologic side of the house. I spent a lot of time at a small base up in Maryland called Fort Meade. Spent a lot of time with the National Security Agency and the U.S. Cyber Command. And so one of the jobs I had when I was up there, I was one of the offensive cyber portfolio leads. So I had the Pacific Fleet. So I had the bad countries, right? And so by doing so, one of the things I was able to do, we did a lot of work with the Department of Treasury. I didn't think I would ever work with the Department of Treasury, but we did. And so this is what drove me to work for Wells Fargo when I got out, because what I was seeing on the inside was that they needed a lot of help. And then I was thinking, I need a job. And so when I finally grew up, I got a job. And so I worked at Wells Fargo. So one thing I learned about the banking industry is that they're very secretive, very channelized to get things done. So in this presentation, I promise you I will give you no layout of bank's layout. I would never give you pictures of inside of the guts of the bank because, one, I have 2 bank clients right now, and they will feel very uncomfortable when we're doing that. But we're going to talk about the banking industry from the aspect of, is the banking industry going too far? And are they getting outside of their critical infrastructure envelope? There's some things we're going to talk about today. I promise I'll get through these very quickly. So we're just going to talk about, significance, the complexity, the banking, the IoT convergence, and futuristic banking. And so first we need to talk about the financial sector, because the banking industry and the banking sector is nested within the financial sector here. And you can see the large amount of money that these U.S. banks have, but what's more important is maintaining that minimum economic infrastructure. When I was working at U.S. Cyber Command, we was always focused on the kinetic side of things. But we had to start looking at things differently because cyber warfare brought about a different space for all of us. And so if you want to attack a bank, what's the best way to learn about a bank? To go to a bank. And so it became very clear that, what the banking industry really meant to this country, very clear, because also when you're playing cyber warfare, you just can't play offense. You got to play defense. And some of the things what became so important to me rather clearly is how important it was for the banks and what they meant to us in terms of maintaining our economic stability. Not only just to the United States, but for our global aspect. If our economic infrastructure here was hit with a cyber attack and become unstable for a couple of days, that's going to have worldwide cascading effects. And so we try our best to make sure it's stabilized. And why this is so important is because I heard somebody mention earlier about sending a large amount of money. And so that large amount of money arrives some of those big pipes inside the banks. The one thing we have to realize is that, look at the bank. We always think about when we go in, there's somebody greeting you, but take that out of your mind, and all of you can think about the guts behind the bank, right? What it means, the network, that infrastructure, is massive. I always say Wells Fargo was a bank, but it really was a technology company. And so we have to rethink about it, because thinking about the trillions of dollars that's flowing through the financial sector every day, and then just alone, there's over almost 120,000 cyber attacks that impact us economically every day. And then when we start looking at the cyber threats against the banking industry, as you can see here, there's been some transition where we always hear on the news about going to the gas pump. You hear always the stories about the ATMs, check the ATMs before you use them, right? Now they're going after the digitized structure. Banks are very good at cybersecurity. Banks are very good when it comes to protecting themselves from a critical infrastructure, but they have a lot of work to do, a lot of work to do. The reason being is because, as we just heard in the previous presentation, all these things are under attack. When I worked at Wells Fargo, one thing I said I'd never do application development. You know what I ended up doing? 75% of my time I was doing application development. I was doing it so much that I was managing the IAM section of policy portfolio, and I saw everybody's dirty laundry. Even when you didn't want me to see it, I saw it because I had to sign off on it. And so these things come into play. And why they come into play? Because banks, just like every other critical infrastructure, rely significantly on legacy systems. Just imagine the large banks in this country have hundreds of legacy applications and systems that they rely on every day. It takes a long time to change that out and update those infrastructure. The banking sector is becoming more digitized and interconnected than ever before. You hear about banking 4.0. Banking 4.0 is saying, wherever you are, so is your bank. Think about that. Think about how that expands the attack surface. Think about the amount of stress and pressure on the bank to make sure that you have 24/7 connectivity and you always have access to your resources. I remember one day working at the bank, we had a hiccup. I thought it was a small hiccup. It was happening on the West Coast. And I was like, oh, we'll be out of this pretty soon. We got good backup. We got good redundancy. I came to work the next day. This ain't just not looking well. 1 o'clock in the morning, the following day, well, the next day, my phone started ringing. Remember, I told you I managed the policy deception portfolio. There was people calling me to put exceptions in the policy because they had got hit with a lot of stuff after the fact, right? So those things happen. Those things happen. But, you know, I saw everybody's dirty laundry. I would tell you, at a bank of that size, and I'm just not talking about Wells Fargo, this is any large bank anywhere in the world, it's very common for all three of these things to be siloed. It depends on how you set up your bank. I remember going in meetings, and I was like, who's your BISO? Oh, we don't know our BISO. So I had to go and look up the BISO for them and invite him to their meeting. The OT side of the house was challenging, just like everybody else said here, really challenging. It's something banks don't really talk about. You talking about an ISAC that don't really share outside of industry? The banking industry. Now, I was in the banking industry, and I was writing a dissertation. I asked them, could I get data on phishing? You know what answer they gave me? No. They don't really share information outside of the industry for obvious reasons, and I respect that. I really do. I really respect that. But earlier I heard comments about, the government supporting industry. Well, when I worked at the National Security Agency with Cyber Command, we shared a lot of information with the Department of Treasury, a lot of information. Because if you really want to know what adversaries are doing, especially when they're going after money, they have to put it somewhere, right? They have to move money. When you're moving money, it's easy to follow, right? And so one thing that we notice is that our connectivity is always susceptible, always. Changes being made, working through all the applications, tens of thousands of applications. These things don't come easy. And then when we talk about, just like everybody else, the IT-OT convergence, right? It's a struggle for us, just like it is for everybody else. And the reason it's a struggle because it doesn't come without risk. Because one of the things you're beginning to see with this, you're beginning to see banks leverage open source type OT. They're using that IT-based IP infrastructure. Guess what that's doing? When you open that up for monitoring of those OT devices and that OT network, guess what? When you open it up for monitoring, you also open it up for susceptibility to being attacked, right? And so it's a double-edged sword. How do you accomplish one without accomplishing the other? And then notice here, I put some things to highlight here. At banks, behavior security is very important. Not only from a customer aspect, Some of you might get warnings and indications that somebody's tried to use your credit card somewhere, but also from an employee. Because when I worked at the bank, one thing that I never had to do was send an email outside the bank. So my question that I start asking is, why do I have email? Take my email away. We should look at this as a practice because most of us don't need email because all of our business is inside of the bank. Now, we did have sectors that needed that outside support. Taking people who've been doing things a certain way for years, and then you're talking about bringing teams together, this is never easy. Because sometimes it might mean disrupting the bank or degrading services for customers. How do you weigh that? You know, it's always a challenge. Data and software convergence, whoo. Thank God for Illinois Tech. Because when I was leaving the bank, that was what we was getting ready to work on. Data management from the identity and access management side of the house. And I knew that was going to be a bearable project. I was so glad Illinois Tech called. And the physical convergence side, you know, that goes without question. We just know that when you look at it from the bank today, a lot of us are not going in interacting with tellers anymore. We're hitting buttons now. And so this is becoming more of a digital physical presence than more of a physical presence. But don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong. Banks still need somewhere to operate. Banks are reducing their footprints, but they're reducing it in a physical aspect in terms of location, but they're increasing it in terms of digitalization. And like I said, with the emergence of IT and OT threats. The other thing banks, big banks, it's not just Wells, but big banks really struggle with is account for business continuity. It's so much, too big. Customers all over the world. Think about the natural disaster we had down in Florida recently, right? Imagine how that impacted big banks. I used to always hate when my phone would ring in the middle of the night because I knew when I looked at it and it was the CISO, I was like, ugh. I mean, I had more work to do. Not that I was afraid of the work. It was always just hard work. And then a high level of operation capacity. This can never happen. This can never go down to a level to where customers are not satisfied. It can never go down to where people in the bank can't do their jobs. Does it happen? Yes, it does. It happens. And then cybersecurity threats. All the threats you've been hearing about all morning, banks have it and more. Obvious reason, why do people attack banks? You guys heard the joke.
Money.
See, you can repeat it. I don't need to repeat it. And here's where the problem lies. Customers are demanding more from banks. Competition demanding more from banks. Banks have to do more for their own survivability right now. Think about fintech companies coming in and just spanking banks on the bike side, right? Big banks have a hard time changing their banking practices. Big banks have a hard time coming up with products and services. Because think about it, a bank like Wells Fargo with over 70 million customers, that's hard. And again, I should apologize up front. I apologize for all these words up here. The words are not for you, they for me. Because I got a lecture tonight, and that lecture is playing in my head right now while I'm talking to you all. So, and remember, banks were implementing technology. When COVID hit, our 3 to 5 year plan went active right then. So we kind of got ahead of things in terms of technology. So how do we catch up in terms of security, especially from the IT and the OT side of the house? It's a challenge. And the one thing that Industry 4.0 is driving in the banking industry is this concept right here of the utility of the bank. Whatever we do face-to-face in the banking industry, we want to do it digitally. People are very relentless when it comes to their banks. They don't take no for an answer. And we still have the same responsibilities online payments, Apple Pay. You can't go anywhere without some other company offer some type of payment. That's hitting banks on the bottom too, because banks are very rigid. There's a lot of opportunity because they're too big to move, to turn quickly. Banks are almost like an aircraft carrier. You don't turn on the dime. Might take you an hour or two to turn around. But banks don't turn around that fast either. Online payment and technologies. All the technologies that's thrown at banks constantly, implementing new technologies. And you'll hear me say this sometime when I'm on the speaking circuit. Technologies, we don't always do it right. We do it rather quickly because we're trying to mitigate a risk, but we never think about the human side of it, right? But the human side will catch up to it later. And that's what we always say, and it never does. Virtual money, the wallet of things, banks have to deal with that now. When you start doing banking digitally and you're doing business overseas or you travel, people don't want to travel with money anymore. They want to travel with a wallet of things. How do banks adjust to that? How do we protect that? Because I know every time I'm reading, every week, somebody's getting hit for the cryptocurrency, right? I'm like, wow. Banking supply chain, this is a big one. Everybody knows this is a tactic. I'm not going to hit you directly. I'm going to hit you downstream, and I'm going to cascade my way back to you. Banks rely on small and medium-sized business like it's nobody's business. They have to. And then those small and medium-sized businesses become back doors if they're not protected properly. And here's what's driving it on. Everybody talking about the futuristic of banking. How do we get there? Is it necessary? Is it needed? Banks are trying to survive, but are they getting outside the scope of the critical infrastructure? Banks are doing well right now, but they're still under heavy attack. And the more they implement new technologies and new products and new services that's digitized, guess what? The threat vector is going to be bigger and bigger, and so is the surface attack area. I never thought that we'd be doing banking in the metaverse, but there's people looking at that right now. So how would it work? What about metaverse regulations for banks? What would that look like? None of us knows. But the banking industry is pushing towards that way for their survival. If one or two banks come out with this futuristic banking, this futuristic banking, and the others don't, they're already behind the power curve. Customers will leave one bank for the other for better services. And with that, I ask you, are banks going too far? The federal government cannot keep pace with the way that banks are implementing technology, the way banks are digitizing everything. And we know in a critical infrastructure that banks need the federal government as well as the federal government needs banks. So it's a partnership. And banks don't really see this side and how hard it is for the federal government to keep pace. I'm not an advocate for the federal government. I just know that even when I was wearing the uniform, this was really hard to do then, and it's even harder to do now because that footprint has just gotten that much bigger. I think banks are moving way too fast right now. And as customers, we're demanding that. So where's the road in the middle where your critical infrastructure footprint covers your digital operation footprint? I don't know. I don't have that answer. But as a researcher, banks happen to be one of my areas, so I need to start paying attention to that. And with that, I promise you all I want to keep you all on. Yes, sir.
So a question I have, I guess, is in what aspect are you challenging whether banks are moving too fast? Because from a monetary perspective, there are some hard-coded kind of immutable requirements that banks have to follow relative to liquidity, right?
Yes.
So no matter what they do from a innovation perspective, they still have to live within the boundaries of liquidity, right?
Yes.
And risk management. So I guess my question is are you challenging whether or not they're moving too fast in that innovation perspective?
Yes.
Or in whether or not regulations can keep up with the security aspects, which is pretty much across the entire, spectrum of industries?
Both of them, right? Innovation. Because we know as banks implement new innovative ideas and products and services, they might be preceding the regulations. Regulations don't happen overnight. It takes time for those regulations to come about. And so at what point, when the regulations come out, will the banks already be leaning over the cliff, right? And so when I worked at the bank, I could tell you, we didn't have a regulation for everything. And we needed regulations for a lot of things, but the regulation was behind because technology was growing so fast. You guys know this as well as I do. We're changing technology overnight. And so if you don't, I think not only just the technology and the regulation, but what about the policy side of it, internal to the bank? It's hard to keep up with that as well.
So do you believe that the innovation is moving too fast for them to be able to manage the risk?
To a certain degree, yes, but the risk is banks going to keep becoming so digitized that they're not able to really manage their risk. And one thing we have to admit about banks, and all of us know this, they will overlend themselves in risk. Banks do that all the time. They take risk. Because if they don't take risk, they don't take money. They're not competitive if they don't take risk. But overextending yourself is not the right way to go. And I think in this area right here, we might be overextending ourselves. I think there needs to be better coordination between the federal government and the banking industry on what is too far, right? Because just think about it. Banks here are just not connected to the U.S. local banks. What about all the banks in the world that's connected to that big financial pipe of pushing money in the middle of the night, right? So that's something we got to pay attention to.
And what about that whole SWIFT system?
Well,
let's not even get started.
I'm not going to comment on that. I can't, but I want to.
We got time for one more question.
So which bank here in the US would you say is the most progressive in terms of big cyber security?
I would say, I would say J.P. Morgan Chase. I'm gonna tell you why. Anytime your CEO stands in front of the reporters and analysts and say, "I have an open checkbook when it comes to cybersecurity," that's the bank that pays the most money for cybersecurity. And other banks, like when I was at Wells Fargo, I got there after. I promise you that I got there after the fallout, right, of the fake accounts. I got there in 2017. So banks have to prepare for those things because they know they're going to get hit hard at some point, and it's going to be very costly to them. So you can't give your CEO an open checkbook for cybersecurity when you got to pay those fines. So you just can't.
So thank you very much, Dr. Calvin. Round of applause for him and all of our speakers this morning. So thank you very much. Orsec is sponsoring our lunch. We're going to do one tour in the interest of time. That tour starts around 12-ish right now. So if you're interested in the tour, it goes from 12 to 12:30. We've got a box lunch out